Hello, my name is Rhodri Jones, and I'm a photographer living in Italy. I've always been something of a romantic, but I guess that's only natural, as my Welsh father met my mother on the Orient Express in Yugoslavia in 1952. An elderly German couple adopted my mother, born in Luxembourg in 1927, so she grew up in Nazi Germany. My parents, who had been youth on opposing sides during World War II, met only 7 years after that conflict. It must have been love. I left the UK the day after I finished my A-levels. I'd met my own Juliet while hitchhiking around Sardinia the previous summer, and decided to move to Italy so that we could be together. Actually, her name isn't Juliet, but Francesca. However, she did live fairly close to Verona, admittedly a bit closer to Modena. Francesca and I spent 5 years together while she studied in university. I did many different jobs, and together we restored an old farmhouse, which became our home. When Francesca won bursaries to continue her studies in the USA, we mutually agreed to separate. We recognized that our lives were moving in different directions. I headed for South America and spent several months traveling around the Andes and Amazon. On my return to Italy, I found work as a light technician for theatre and rock concerts. This was seasonal work that paid quite well. So the next winter, I could travel around East Africa for 6 months and return there the following winter. It was during these travels that I took up photography, initially as a hobby. I wasn't much good at writing, but I did want to document all the wondrous things I was seeing on my travels. Photography seemed like the easy option. Eventually, my skills in photography improved, and I was well-traveled. So, at 26, I decided to jump into the deep end and move to Nicaragua to cover the conflict there. I was politically inclined and saw the conflict between the Sandinista government and the Contras, backed by Ronald Reagan, as a modern version of the Spanish Republican government defending the onslaught in the 1930s. I offered my services to the Sandinista press agency, Agencia Nueva Nicaragua, who hired me immediately. Told you, I am a romantic. There I was, risking my life for the equivalent of $150 a month. Who hasn't made mistakes in their life? In some ways, the beauty of youth is our innocence, but one could also interpret innocence as being somewhat gullible. Little did I imagine that over 30 years later, Daniel Ortega would still be president. In fact, a despotic dictator. Back to photography. While working for the agency, I was quickly learning the ropes of my new trade, especially when I was assigned to photograph Mr. Ortega during the elections of February 1990. I had access to him that the international press photographers envied. The Sandinistas lost those elections and the conflict in Nicaragua ended, and so I started to spend more time in El Salvador. There I was working with local human rights organizations as well as local unions, who were all affiliated to the FMLN, an umbrella group of 5 leftist organizations trying to overthrow the extreme right-wing government of Arena, and that had been responsible for the murder of the Catholic Archbishop of the country, Oscar Romero, in 1980. Thereby triggering a particularly vicious civil war. In El Salvador, my job was to document the atrocities being inflicted on the civilian population by the Guardia Nacional, and other government forces, as well as documenting how civilians in the liberated areas lived. I don't regret having worked for the FMLN. By the summer of '91, it was obvious that the conflict in El Salvador was also coming to an end. So I decided to move back to Europe, where, of course, in the meantime, the Iron Curtain had fallen. As a child, I had spent long periods in Germany, and I will never forget seeing the Iron Curtain for the first time. It was on the Elbe River. There were two bridges which had been destroyed during World War II and which had been left as they were. Beyond the river was that 3-meter fence, stretching as far as the eye could see and punctuated by guard towers. It was a chilling sight for a 14-year-old, and it had been there since I was born. So naturally, perhaps, I thought it would always be there. By January '92, I was in Albania, the last country to see its communist regime fall. I headed to the north of the country, to Schlac, and soon discovered that I was the first Westerner to visit the area since the Second World War. Schlac was a Catholic enclave with some very peculiar customs in a predominantly Muslim country. The area had suffered particularly harsh repression under Enver Hoxha's criminal regime. The poverty was alarming. There I was, someone who had worked for left-wing organizations, now seeing the other side of the coin. The terrible consequences of a totalitarian communist dictatorship. Those mountain peoples are incredibly hospitable. I guess they were as curious about me as I was about them. But they were also incredibly patient. I remember countless quite heated debates where I was trying to convince them of the advantages of cooperative farming, while they, who had been forced to live it, calmly explained why it simply didn't work in practice. By now, I was working for non-governmental organizations, like Oxfam, who initially sent relief aid to Schlac and decided later to start small community projects, bringing water to the villages or rebuilding primary schools that had literally been totally dismantled in the chaos following the regime's collapse. This meant that I was to revisit the area and neighbouring Dukhajin many times over the next 8 years, and so was able to create a rapport, indeed even friendships, which still last today with many of those fine people. Five years ago, I finally published a photographic book, Cosier, So Be It, on their ancient customs and traditions. The next 10 years saw me almost constantly travelling around the world on contracts for NGOs, including the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization and World Food Programme, as well as the Ford Foundation and, of course, Oxfam. However, I was also contemporarily working on personal projects, as the one in Albania, which I then sold as reportage to magazines and newspapers. In 1995, I visited China for the first time. I was simply intrigued to see for myself what was happening behind the logo Made in China, that I was seeing all over the world. Until 2007, I spent on average at least 2 or 3 months every year in the People's Republic, working mainly on 2 personal projects. One on the internal migration of peoples moving from the countryside to China's booming cities, and one on China's minorities and their relationships with the Han majority. This work eventually led to the publication of my first book, Made in China, in 2002. Since I have published several other books, including one on Wales called Return and All. Next year, I hope to publish my latest long-term personal project, Feste. It's a study and celebration of Italian popular and modern culture, which reveals not only its local customs and traditions, but also how the country has changed in the last 30 years. Photography has moved, for me, from being initially a hobby to then a trade, an obsession, and finally a raison d'être, a purpose to life. In all 4 stages, the practice has given me immense pleasure and satisfaction. I know photographers well into their 80s who continue to practice professionally. Should I be fortunate enough to live that long, I have no doubt that I will continue to photograph as my father, a historian, now 90, continues to write. I guess that anyone who is lucky enough to find their calling in life is both blessed and hugely privileged. I recognize we are in a minority. However, I also know that it's never too late to find a new passion and start anew. One of the world's best photographers, Sebastião Salgado, initially trained and worked as an economist. I've met lawyers and doctors who, at my age, have become professional photographers, although admittedly that involved a drastic pay cut. Yet looking back, I still remember how much satisfaction photography gave me when it was simply my hobby. Today, universities offer degrees and even PhDs in photography, which frankly I find somewhat bemusing, given that technological advances have made the act of taking a good photograph even easier. My eyesight isn't what it used to be. Hey, but no worries. Modern autofocus is as efficient as my manual focusing ever was. Martin Parr, England's best-known photographer, now 68, and as active as he was 40 years ago, openly admits that he uses his digital cameras in P or program mode. You just point and shoot. Another great thing about photography is that it has countless languages. You can photograph just about anything that turns you on, from nature to buildings, or from animals to humans. There are no limits. I even know some blind photographers who simply react to the sounds around them. Please remember that now more than ever, we are all potentially great photographers.